Lucas had heard the rumors about the Ashford Hotel, abandoned, eerie, and filled with the whispers of those who had vanished within its walls. He never believed them, until the moment he stepped into room 313, the room that no one dared to enter. Now trapped in the heart of a centuries-old curse, Lucas must uncover the dark truth behind the hotel's twisted history before it consumes him too. The clock is ticking, the walls are closing in, and as the story unfolds, Lucas realizes there's no escaping a place that exists beyond time. A place where the story is never truly finished. Lucas felt the engine of his car rumble low as he drove along the deserted road, each mile taking him further away from the city. Night was beginning to fall, and the sky was tinged with a deep purple, with no stars visible above. The cell signal had been lost some time ago, but he didn't mind. He needed a break from the constant buzz of city life to focus on writing his next book, far away from distractions. Hotel Phoenix appeared suddenly in front of him, its weathered facade and a faint light flickering at the entrance as if resisting the passage of time. It was a large building, 3 stories tall, its bricks covered in moss and the glass windows slightly fogged by moisture. It looked like it had once been grand, but now it seemed to be in decline, forgotten by the world. He parked the car and, unhurried, grabbed his suitcase from the back seat. As he entered, the hotel smelled of dust and old wood. The floorboards creaked beneath his every step, and the sound seemed amplified in the deep silence of the space. There was no movement at the front desk, but Lucas knew someone had to be there. The hotel was still in business after all. The counter was empty, but a small bell rested on the side, close to the wall. He pressed it lightly, as though hoping to ease the tension that was already beginning to grow in his chest. The sound of metal echoed down the empty hallway. A few minutes later, a man appeared through a door leading from the back. An elderly figure with white hair, thick glasses that obscured most of his face, and a simple uniform that seemed worn but neatly pressed. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to Hotel Phoenix," the man said in a deep voice that seemed distant, almost hollow. "Good evening. I have a reservation," Lucas replied, trying to keep his tone friendly, but the hotel's peculiar atmosphere was already making him uneasy. He stepped closer to the counter and handed over his ID card. The man studied the document without haste, as though examining each detail with excessive care before he spoke again. "We have a good number of rooms available. However, there is one in particular I would advise you to avoid." His eyes briefly lifted to meet Lucas's gaze, but he quickly looked away, losing focus for a moment. Which room? Lucas couldn't help but ask. His curiosity piqued. There was something oddly intriguing about the warning, though he didn't want to press the matter too much. The receptionist hesitated before responding, as if searching for the right words. "Room 313, he finally said in a hushed tone, almost as if speaking a forbidden name. "I wouldn't recommend it, sir. Better to choose another room." The reply was immediate, but Lucas sensed there was more to the story than what the man was letting on. There was something in his tone that suggested a deeper unease, but the receptionist quickly handed Lucas the keys to a different room, avoiding further elaboration. "Your room is on the 2nd floor, number 212. No issues there," he said, smiling, though it seemed strained, as though he were trying to mask some hidden tension. Lucas took the keys, and despite the slight feeling of doubt rising in him, decided not to press further. He thanked the man and made his way to the stairs, climbing slowly, the silence pressing in around him. The hallway to his left stretched on endlessly, lined with old wooden doors and faint lights that barely illuminated the space. When he reached the door to his room, he opened it and stepped inside. The room was simple but comfortable. A large bed, a window with a view of the outside, and a desk for writing. It seemed like the perfect place to focus on his work. The cold breeze coming through the open window didn't feel quite natural, and Lucas took a deep breath before walking over to close it. The silence in the room was absolute, but there was something about the space that made him uneasy. He wasn't sure what it was, but a sense of strangeness was settling into his chest. As he set his suitcase down on the bed, he heard a distant noise, faint knocking or perhaps footsteps echoing from somewhere deeper in the hallway. He froze, listening closely, but then quickly brushed it off. It was probably just the old building settling, or some noise from the wind. He lay down on the bed, his exhaustion pressing against his eyelids, but sleep wouldn't come. Something about the place didn't sit right. The sound returned, clearer this time, almost like a soft tapping, but it was too rhythmic to be the wind. Lucas sat up in bed, feeling that growing discomfort in the pit of his stomach. He glanced toward the dark corridor outside the door. The hotel was silent once again, but this time the silence felt wrong. The noise was back, this time more distinct, faint but unmistakable. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Lucas lay there in the quiet room, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling crawling up his spine. The noises had stopped, but the unease remained. He pulled the blanket higher around his shoulders, attempting to convince himself that it was just the creaks of an old building, nothing more. But a part of him, the part that had always been sensitive to the unseen, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It was just after midnight. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the window slightly, but there was no sound of rain. The storm, if it was coming, was still far off. Suddenly, a soft thud echoed through the hall. Lucas froze, his heart skipping. A beat. The sound was distant but clear, like something heavy had fallen on the floor in the hallway. It was followed by another faint thud, then another, and another, each one growing slightly louder, as though whatever was making the noise was moving closer. He sat up in bed, staring at the door. His mind began to race, wondering if the sounds were just the hotel settling, maybe a door creaking or a piece of furniture toppling over. But no, this wasn't the same. It was rhythmic, deliberate. After a few moments, Lucas couldn't take it anymore. His curiosity got the best of him. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and grabbed his flashlight from the nightstand, flicking it on as he made his way toward the door. The cold air in the hallway hit him immediately when he stepped out, a stark contrast to the warmth of the room. The corridor was dim, the only light coming from a flickering bulb further down the hallway. The noise had stopped for the moment, but Lucas could still feel it in his bones. Something was off. He walked slowly, trying to make no sound, his footsteps almost swallowed by the creaky floorboards beneath him. He reached the spot where the noise had seemed loudest, just outside the door to room 313. The door was slightly ajar, the dim light from the hallway creeping into the dark room beyond. The door didn't appear to have been disturbed, yet the hair on the back of Lucas's neck stood on end, as if the place itself was calling to him. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, feeling an odd pull. The warning from the receptionist echoed in his mind, but the curiosity gnawed at him harder. Room 313. What was it about this room? Why had the man been so insistent? He was about to turn away to return to the safety of his own room when he heard something else, a soft whisper, too quiet to understand, coming from inside the room. His breath caught in his throat. Without thinking, his hand reached out for the doorknob. It turned easily, as if it had been left unlocked on purpose. The door creaked open slowly, and Lucas stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was cold, far colder than the hallway, and the air felt stale, as if it had been sealed off from the rest of the hotel for years. It looked like any other hotel room, an old bed with faded sheets, a small writing desk, a window covered with heavy curtains, but there was something wrong with it. The furniture seemed out of place, arranged awkwardly as if hastily put together. And in the far corner, Lucas noticed something even stranger, a large, ornate mirror that reflected only a faint outline of his own image, blurry and distorted, as though it was smeared with fog. He moved toward it, drawn inexplicably, his heart pounding in his chest. As his reflection grew clearer, he saw something in the corner of the glass, a figure standing in the shadows, watching him. It was faint at first, almost like a trick of the light, but then it became clearer, a man tall and thin, his face obscured by dark hair, his eyes hollow and unblinking. Lucas staggered back, his heart racing. His flashlight dropped to the floor, rolling away as he backed toward the door. He couldn't breathe. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the sound of everything else. The figure in the mirror didn't move. He stood there, frozen for what felt like an eternity, staring at the reflection, unable to take his eyes off of it. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The room was silent again. Lucas scrambled to the door, fumbling with the knob, desperate to escape. When the door finally swung open, he almost fell into the hallway, gasping for breath. The cold air hit his face like a slap, but it did nothing to calm the panic rising in his chest. He didn't look back. He rushed to his room, locking the door behind him, but even as he lay back down on the bed, his heart still racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still watching him from the depths of that cursed room. The night stretched on, and Lucas couldn't find sleep. His mind was racing, replaying the strange encounter in room 313 over and over again. The figure in the mirror. Who was it? What did it want? And why had it felt so real? He glanced at the clock beside his bed, its red digits flashing 3:47 a.m. The darkness outside seemed to press in closer, the silence growing oppressive. His nerves were shot, and no matter how much he tried to convince himself that he was just tired, that it was all his imagination, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with this place. When he finally managed to fall into an uneasy sleep, the hotel seemed to close in around him. In his dreams, he was standing in room 313 again, but this time the room was different. It was pristine, full of light, and the bed was made with fresh, white linens. But the man in the mirror, his face was clearer now, his eyes wide and empty, his lips parted, as if trying to say something. Lucas woke with a start, his heart pounding. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, breathing heavily, and glanced around the room. It was still dark, still silent. He needed answers. He couldn't just ignore what was happening here, not anymore. The hotel, the mirror, the strange feeling that hung in the air, it all felt connected. He grabbed his coat and left the room, heading down the narrow corridor toward the lobby. As he passed room 313 again, the door was still slightly ajar, but this time the cold seemed to seep into the hallway from within. He stepped back, but before he could take another step, the faint sound of murmuring reached his ears. He froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the building settling. The voice, soft and unintelligible, was coming from behind the door. He knew he shouldn't, but the pull was irresistible. He walked toward the door, his footsteps muffled against the worn carpet, and nudged. It opened just enough to peer inside. The room was dark, but the faint outline of the mirror gleamed in the corner. As his eyes adjusted, he saw something that made his stomach drop. On the floor beneath the mirror was an old, yellowing piece of paper, half hidden beneath the edge of a chair. Lucas stepped into the room, his breath shallow, and crouched to pick it up. It was a faded photograph crinkled with age. It showed the hotel in its prime, a bustling place full of life, its tall windows gleaming in the sunlight. But there was something off about the image. It wasn't just the wear and tear of time. There was something wrong with it. In the corner of the photo, standing in front of the grand entrance, was a man a man he recognized, the figure from the mirror. Lucas's breath caught in his throat as he looked closer. The man had the same hollow eyes, the same dark, unkempt hair. It was him, but who was he? Why was his image tied to this place? The sound of footsteps behind him made Lucas snap his head up, and he spun around to see the receptionist standing in the doorway, his face a mask of disapproval. "You shouldn't be in here," the man said quietly, his voice low and tense. His eyes were wide now, full of something, fear maybe, or something darker. "I told you to avoid room 313. Lucas stood up, the photo still clutched in his hand. "Who is he?" he demanded, his voice rising. "The man in the picture. What happened here?" The receptionist's face hardened, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then finally his gaze flickered to the floor, almost as if he were weighing his words. "That man," he began slowly, "was a guest here many years ago. His name was Carlos. He came to the hotel to write, just like you, and he stayed in that very room." Lucas's mind was racing. What happened to him? The receptionist sighed heavily, as if the weight of the memory was too much to bear. "He vanished. No one knows what happened to him. But before he disappeared, he was different. People said he was obsessed with something. Something in room 313. They said he was driven mad by it." Lucas glanced toward the mirror again, the image of Carlos still fresh in his mind. "What do you mean, obsessed? What was in that room?" The receptionist's eyes darkened, and he stepped closer. To Lucas, "Some things are better left untouched. You've already seen it, haven't you? The man in the mirror, that's Carlos. His soul is still trapped here, and it's been calling for someone to take his place. He couldn't leave until he finished what he started, writing about the horrors of this hotel." Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean, take his place?" The receptionist's voice dropped even lower, a whisper now. "Carlos tried to write the truth about the hotel, the things that happened here, the terrible events, the darkness in the walls. But in the end, it drove him mad. His soul got caught in the hotel, bound to room 313, and now it wants someone else to finish his work." Lucas felt the weight of the man's words, and the silence that followed was thick with meaning. The image of Carlos in the mirror flashed in his mind again, his eyes hollow and desperate. "What happens to the people who stay in that room?" Lucas asked, though he already feared the answer. "They disappear," the receptionist said quietly, "like Carlos, and no one remembers them. They become part of the hotel, lost in its history. The room, it keeps them, traps them." Lucas could feel his heart pounding in his chest. "But why me? Why now?" The receptionist shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know, but it's happened before. You're here for a reason, just like Carlos was, and if you stay long enough, you'll be part of the hotel's history too, just like him." Lucas stood frozen, the receptionist's words echoing in his mind. His stomach churned, a cold sweat coating his skin. The man's warning about Carlos, the mirror, and the cursed room weighed heavily on him. Disappear. That was the last thing he wanted. But the pull to understand what had happened, to uncover the hotel's secrets, was irresistible. There was no turning back now. The receptionist was still watching him, his pale eyes filled with fear, but also something else. Guilt. "You need to leave," the man said, his voice trembling slightly. "Now, before it's too late. You don't understand what you're dealing with." Lucas's pulse quickened. He was torn. Part of him wanted to run, to get out of this place and never look back. But another part, the part that had driven him to this remote hotel in the first place, wanted answers. He couldn't just walk away. Not after what he had seen, what he had felt. "I need to know what happened to Carlos," Lucas said, his voice tight. "And what's in that room? I can't leave without understanding it." The receptionist seemed to shrink at his words, his face falling into a shadow of regret. He took a deep breath and finally stepped back, motioning for Lucas to follow him. "Come with me," he said, his voice low, filled with dread. "There's something you need to see." Without another word, Lucas followed the receptionist down the narrow hallway. The air seemed to grow colder the further they walked, and the silence between them was thick with anticipation. They reached the stairs at the end of the corridor, and Lucas glanced up. Room 313 was still there, its door cracked slightly open. The feeling of being watched washed over him once again, like invisible eyes were following him from the shadows. The receptionist led him downstairs, through a small kitchen area, and into a back hallway that Lucas hadn't noticed before. The walls were lined with old portraits, faded, yellowed with time, and draped in thick layers of dust. But one portrait caught his eye. A young woman in an old-fashioned dress, her eyes staring directly at him with an unsettling intensity. Her smile was faint, but her eyes were hollow, like she knew something Lucas didn't. The receptionist stopped in front of a wooden door at the end of the hall. He turned to Lucas, his expression grave. "This room," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper, "was sealed off a long time ago. It's not part of the regular hotel. It's something else." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, something else?" The man hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but then he spoke. "This hotel has a history, a dark one. Room 313 was never supposed to be used for guests. It was always meant to be a place for those who never left. It was where people were locked away, driven mad by the hotel's secrets, but it was sealed off after Carlos disappeared." Lucas felt a shiver run down his spine as the receptionist slowly unlocked the door with a creaking key. The old wood groaned as the door opened, revealing nothing but pitch-black darkness beyond. "Why didn't you tell me about this before?" Lucas asked, his voice tight with suspicion. The man shook his head, his face filled with sorrow. "I didn't want you to be involved. I didn't want you to know, to see it for yourself. But now it's too late. Once you've seen room 313, once you've heard the whispers, it's over." Before Lucas could respond, the receptionist stepped back, motioning for him to enter. Reluctantly, Lucas stepped into the darkness, the air, cold and damp around him. As soon as he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him with a loud bang, plunging him into complete silence. The air was thick with mildew, and Lucas could feel the weight of the room pressing in on him, the walls seeming to close in. He flicked on his flashlight, but the beam didn't reach far. The room was much larger than it appeared from the outside. The flashlight illuminated a table in the center of the room, covered in dust. Old papers were scattered on it, some crumpled and torn, and on the far wall there was another mirror, but this one was different. It wasn't the same ornate mirror from room 313. This one was large and simple, its surface warped and twisted, as though the glass itself was trying to distort reality. As Lucas moved closer, his heart began to race. He could see something. In the reflection, a shadowy figure standing just behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing there. His pulse quickened. There was a small desk next to the mirror, and as Lucas approached, he saw a journal lying open on it. He walked over to it, his hands trembling slightly as he picked it up. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting was still legible. October 2nd, 1923. "The whispers are growing louder. I hear them at night. They call my name, calling me to the room. I've tried to resist, but there's no escaping it. I can feel them inside my head, inside my bones, telling me to finish what I started. I must write it down. The hotel won't let me leave." Lucas's eyes widened. It was Carlos's handwriting, the same handwriting he had seen in the photo. He flipped through the pages quickly, scanning the entries. October 15th, 1923. "It's too late now. I've seen the truth. The hotel is alive and it needs to feed. I can hear its voice in my mind, urging me to write, to finish the story. But what happens when I'm done? What happens when the story is finished?" The final entry was dated 2 days before Carlos vanished, October 17th, 1923. "The room is calling me. I have to finish the work. The hotel. It doesn't want me to leave. It won't let me leave. Lucas's heart was pounding now. He could feel the temperature drop even further, the oppressive weight of the room, making it hard to breathe. He looked back at the mirror, and this time, the shadowy figure wasn't just a blur. It was standing directly behind him. It was Carlos, his hollow eyes staring directly at Lucas, his face twisted in a look of desperation. And then the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The voice came from behind Lucas, low, ragged, like a breath caught in the throat of someone long dead. His body froze, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. The words were unmistakable, each syllable hanging in the air like a ghost, a warning. Too late to heed. "You shouldn't have come." Lucas spun around, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but the room was empty. No figure, no shadow, nothing. His breath came in shallow bursts as he tried to steady his racing heart. The image of Carlos's reflection was still vivid in his mind, the hollow eyes, the twisted face. But there was no sign of him now. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the rapid beat of his heart in his chest. The room, it felt alive now, alive in a way that made his skin crawl. The walls seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if the hotel itself was aware of him, watching him, waiting. He glanced back at the journal on the desk, his hand still trembling as he turned the brittle pages. The words Carlos had written were clear, but Lucas couldn't bring himself to look away from the mirror now. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to get out of this place and never look back. But something in the air held him captive, a strange, magnetic pull that he couldn't explain. Then, just as the last entry in the journal faded from his mind, a soft sound echoed through the room. A whisper. It wasn't a voice this time. It was something else, something ancient, something that wasn't meant to be heard. Lucas felt a pressure in his chest, like the very air around him had thickened, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. The whispers came again, this time louder, more insistent. They seemed to rise from the mirror itself, swirling in the air around him. He didn't understand the words at first. They were a jumble, disjointed and broken, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, desperate. "You're the one. It needs to finish," the voice hissed. "Finish, or you will stay." The words faded into the cacophony of whispers, blending together into an unintelligible chorus. Lucas couldn't make sense of them, but the feeling of dread was enough to make his blood run cold. It was like the room was closing in on him, the walls shifting, moving, as if the hotel itself were breathing. In the corner of the room, the mirror began to distort. The reflection shimmered, like water rippling on a dark lake, and then it solidified. Again, but it was different now. The figure in the mirror had changed. It wasn't Carlos anymore. It was something else. An inhuman shape, its features distorted, twisted beyond recognition. The eyes were wide, black pools of emptiness, and the mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "Don't fight it," the thing in the mirror whispered. Its voice was both many voices and one, all layered together, overlapping, until they became one low, guttural sound. "We're waiting for you." Lucas staggered backward, his mind reeling. He reached for the door, but the room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing tighter and tighter, cutting off his escape. He tried the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, just like the last time. His pulse throbbed in his temples, and panic began to flood his senses. He had to get out. He had to leave this place before it was too late. But the whispers grew louder. They were coming from everywhere now, from the walls, from the mirror, from the very air around him. The hotel was alive, and it was hungry. Suddenly, the cold grew unbearable. His breath fogged in the air, his fingers stiffening, his teeth beginning to chatter. The whispers now grew into a shrill cacophony, a jarring, piercing sound that seemed to drive into his skull, splitting his mind in two. "You are the next one. You will take his place." The words struck him like a physical blow, and the room began to swirl around him. The darkness pressed in like a vice, suffocating him. He felt something tugging at him, pulling him toward the mirror, toward the figure that was still watching him from within. In a panic, Lucas closed his eyes, trying to block out the madness, the whispers, the weight of the hotel pressing down on him. He felt something pulling at him, reaching inside him, and for a brief moment he thought he might lose himself to it, to the hotel, to the darkness that called him. Then, as quickly as it had started, the pressure eased. The whispering stopped. The room was still. The only sound now was his own labored breathing. He opened his eyes, the world still spinning in front of him. The mirror was back to its normal state, silent, smooth, and reflecting nothing but his own terrified face. But in his reflection, there was something new, a tiny, almost imperceptible detail. His own eyes were no longer entirely his own. They were darker than before, the irises hollow, as if something deep inside of him had shifted, like the reflection was no longer his own. "No," Lucas whispered to himself, stumbling backward. His mind raced, panic bubbling inside him. What had just happened? Had he been close to losing himself? To becoming one with the hotel? A voice cut through the silence, so clear it felt like it was coming from within his own head. "Finish what Carlos started." Lucas staggered back, his heart pounding, feeling the pull of the mirror once again. But this time, it wasn't just the room that had changed. It was him. Something inside of him had shifted, something that couldn't be undone. He needed to finish the story. Lucas's mind raced as he staggered away from the mirror, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers were still there, swirling just beneath. The surface of his consciousness urging him forward, pulling him into the depths of the hotel's madness. The pull was undeniable. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, to escape, but something held him in place. Something dark and insidious. The journal was still in his hand, the pages yellowed and brittle under his trembling fingers. The words Carlos had written haunted him, each sentence more disturbing than the last. "The hotel won't let me leave." But now, the truth felt closer. The hotel had a story to tell, one that was unfinished, and somehow Lucas had become a part of it. He had no idea how, but the very essence of the place, the oppressive darkness, the cold whispers, the pull of the mirror, had taken root in him. He could feel it crawling under his skin. He couldn't leave, not without knowing. Desperation clawed at his mind as he glanced back at the journal. The last pages were unfinished, and in his gut, Lucas knew that he was meant to write it. To finish Carlos's story. But why? What was it about him that made the hotel choose him? The mirror flickered again, and for a split second he saw something. It wasn't just his reflection, it was his face. But it wasn't. The eyes, his eyes, were dark, hollow, full of something terrible, and behind him, in the shifting shadows, the figure stood again. Carlos, or whatever had become of him, the hotel was calling him. It wanted him to stay. Lucas shook his head, forcing himself to look away. He couldn't afford to be distracted. He had to finish what Carlos started. But how? Where did he even begin? The journal had no answers, only fragmented thoughts, dark ramblings of a man lost in the depths of his own mind. But then, something caught Lucas's eye, a loose page tucked between two others, one that had slipped out of place. He grabbed it. It was a letter, written in Carlos's shaky, frantic handwriting. October 10th, 1923. I can feel the walls closing in. The hotel wants me to finish the story, but I don't know how. I've seen things, horrible things. There's a room hidden deep in the bowels of this place, a room that no one talks about. It's where the souls of those lost here are kept, trapped for eternity. They want me to write it down, to tell the story, but I can't. I'm not strong enough. I saw him again today. The man in the mirror. He looks like me. I think he's trying to replace me. If I write this down, I will become him. I'll become part of the hotel. I'll never leave. God help me. Lucas's hands were shaking as he read the letter, a chill sweeping through him. The hidden room, the souls trapped within it. And Carlos, he had been trying to warn him, trying to escape, but he couldn't. And now Lucas was here in the same place, struggling with the same choices. The weight of the hotel's curse was too much to ignore. It wasn't just a place, it was alive. And it wanted him. It needed him to finish the story. With a deep, shuddering breath, Lucas glanced back at the mirror. The figure was still there, watching him, its hollow eyes now focused on his. He could feel the pull intensify, the room closing. In around him. Finish it, the whisper came again, clearer now. It was Carlos's voice, but distorted, twisted, as if it had been broken by time and madness. You have to finish it. The journal slipped from Lucas's hands and landed on the floor with a soft thud, but he didn't pick it up. His eyes were locked on the mirror, on the figure in the reflection, and his feet moved toward it before he even realized what was happening. Finish it. He was no longer sure whether it was his own thoughts or the voice of the hotel speaking through him, but the need to know, to understand, consumed him. He could feel the weight of the hotel's history pressing down on him, urging him to uncover the truth, to finish the story, to write it all down. He had to. It was the only way to escape. Or was it? Lucas stepped closer to the mirror, his reflection distorted by the shifting light. The man in the mirror, Carlos, or whatever he had become, stared back at him with those hollow eyes, as if waiting, as if he knew what Lucas was about to do. The hotel was alive, and it was hungry. The hotel wanted its story to be told, no matter the cost. Without thinking, Lucas reached out toward the mirror, his fingers brushing against the cold glass. He expected resistance, but there was none. The mirror rippled like water, and in an instant Lucas was pulled inside. A jolt of cold shot through his body as he was consumed by the darkness within the reflection. He gasped, but his breath caught in his throat as the world around him twisted. It wasn't just the mirror anymore, the walls were moving. The floor beneath him was shifting, and the weight of the hotel crushed down on him. He was inside the mirror now, trapped, just like Carlos. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding him. Finish it! Lucas felt the darkness swallow him. Whole, and for the first time, he understood. The hotel wasn't just trapping souls, it was rewriting them, and now his soul, like Carlos's, was bound to this place, forever. And the story would never end. Lucas's senses were overwhelmed. The moment he stepped into the mirror, the world around him seemed to fracture and bend, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The whispers swirled around him, drowning him in their cacophony, each voice a distorted, anguished cry. Some of the voices were familiar, Carlos's voice, cracked and distant, and some were foreign, strange, like the voices of those who had been here long before. Welcome, a voice hissed, echoing in his mind. The temperature dropped. Lucas could feel his breath fog in front of him, and yet he was no longer aware of his body. It was as if he had become part of the mirror, part of the darkness that consumed it. He wanted to scream, to fight against the crushing weight of the void, but his mouth wouldn't open. His limbs felt numb, as if they were made of stone. And then a figure appeared in front of him, materializing out of the shifting shadows. It was a woman, dressed in the same old-fashioned clothes as the portrait he had seen earlier, the woman with the hollow eyes. Her smile was faint, but it didn't reach her eyes. She stood just beyond his reach, watching him with a mixture of sadness and something darker. "You've joined us now," she said, her voice both calm and unnerving. "The hotel will not let you leave." Her words sent a jolt through Lucas's mind, and in an instant the oppressive weight of the place seemed to shift. He felt himself falling, sinking deeper into the abyss, the void growing darker around him. "Who are you?" Lucas tried to speak, but his voice was a faint whisper in the storm of voices surrounding him. His throat felt like it was filled with sand. "I am one of many," she replied, her expression distant. "We are the echoes, the lost ones, the souls trapped by the hotel, by its hunger." Lucas's eyes widened. The echoes, the lost souls who had been consumed by the hotel and forced to remain here, forever bound to the walls, to the mirror. She stepped closer, her feet gliding over the floor without sound. Her form flickered, like a glitch in the fabric of reality itself, but her eyes never left his. They were empty, hollow eyes, just like the ones in the portrait. "You are just like him," she murmured, almost as if speaking to herself. "Carlos, he thought he could escape too, but the hotel wants us, it calls to us, and once it's called, you can never leave." Lucas's mind raced as he tried to process her words. Carlos. He had seen Carlos's reflection in the mirror, felt the pull to finish the story. But now, standing in this dark, shifting void, he understood what it meant. The hotel didn't just trap people, it consumed them. It tore them apart, hollowed them out, and kept their echoes, remnants of their souls, forever lost in its walls. Why? Why is it doing this? Lucas's voice was barely audible, but the woman heard him. Her lips twitched, a ghost of a smile crossing her face. "Because it is hungry," she said simply, the words almost too casual for the horror they carried. "It feeds on the lost, on the ones who come here looking for answers, the ones who are drawn to its darkness." Lucas felt his heart beat faster. The darkness. That was what had drawn him here. That was what had pulled him into room 313. The story, the need to write, the story, it wasn't meant to be written. He spoke the words out loud, the realization sinking into him with a cold weight. He understood now. He had been part of the story all along. The hotel needed him to finish it, to keep the cycle going, to feed the darkness that kept it alive. The woman's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, Lucas thought he saw something else behind her, a flash of movement, a darker, more twisted form lurking in the shadows. She turned as if sensing it, and then looked back at him with that same sad, hollow expression. "You have two choices now," she said, her voice suddenly more distant, as if she were fading. "You can finish the story, you can write it all down, and the hotel will let you become part of it. You'll be free from the mirror, free from the echoes. You'll become one of us." Lucas's blood ran cold. "Or," the woman's form flickered, again her features warping in and out of focus. "Or you can refuse. You can try to fight it, but then you'll join the others, the ones who failed before you, the ones who tried to resist the call. You'll be trapped in the darkness." A whisper in the void, lost forever. The words hit Lucas like a blow, knocking the breath out of him. He didn't want to be lost. He didn't want to disappear into the endless night of the hotel's curse. But what other choice did he have? He couldn't keep running. And yet, he didn't want to become one of the lost souls, one of the echoes that never found peace. "I don't have a choice," he whispered, the truth sinking in. He had been brought here for a reason. The hotel had chosen him to finish the story. It needed him. The woman nodded, her expression unchanged. "None of us do." Her form began to fade, the darkness closing in around Lucas. But before she disappeared, completely, she said one last thing, her voice a distant echo, "The story will never end. Lucas stood in the endless void, the woman's words echoing in his mind like the slow, steady beat of a drum. The story will never end. The story. That was why he was here. That was why he had been drawn to the hotel, to room 313. He had come seeking answers, but now he realized that the only thing the hotel offered was an endless cycle, one that had claimed countless souls before him and would likely claim countless more after. A heavy silence settled over him. The dark figures that had surrounded him, the whispers, the oppressive weight of the hotel itself, everything had faded away, leaving only the distorted reflections of himself in the shattered pieces of the mirror. His own face stared back at him, twisted in fear, his eyes hollow and dark. The mirror, that cursed endless mirror, was no longer just a reflection. It was a doorway, a passageway between his world and whatever haunted this place. He could still hear the whispers, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. They were coming from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the very walls of the hotel. Finish the story. The words haunted him, coming from all directions. You must finish it. Lucas squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the suffocating dread creeping into his soul. He couldn't stay here, trapped forever in this nightmare. He needed to escape, but the more he tried to resist, the stronger the pull became. He was bound, tethered to this cursed hotel by something deeper than any physical force. The story had already begun, and it was already too late to turn back. He opened his eyes again, the broken fragments of the mirror shimmering in front of him like stars scattered across an endless night sky. The hotel had already claimed him. There was no escaping it now. No matter how much he wanted to fight, to flee, the story would keep him here. The hotel would not let him go. He had become a part of its narrative. And now, like Carlos before him, Lucas had no choice but to write the end. His mind flashed back to the journal, the final pages he had read earlier. Those pages had been incomplete, disjointed. Carlos had been trying to warn him, trying to tell him that there was no escape, that the hotel fed on the ones who came seeking answers, that once you entered, you were part of the story, and the story would never end. The hotel needs you. The thought stabbed through his mind, and he staggered backward, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He was trapped, and he could feel it now, more than ever. The very walls of the hotel seemed to close in on him, pressing down with unbearable weight. Suddenly, a flash of light flickered in the distance. The air shimmered, and before he could react, the shadows around him began to twist and warp. A figure appeared, stepping out of the darkness. Carlos. But it wasn't the Carlos from the photos, the one who had once been full of life. This was a version of Carlos that had been warped by the hotel, his body thin and skeletal, his eyes wide and glassy. He looked at Lucas with a hollow, empty stare. You see now, don't you? Carlos's voice was hoarse, a rasping whisper that seemed to come from all around him. It never ends. We are the echoes, the voices that remain long after the bodies are gone. We are the ones who write the story, and we cannot escape it. Not anymore. Lucas's heart thundered in his chest. The figure of Carlos reached out to him, his fingers thin and brittle. Come with me, he rasped. Come with us. No, Lucas said, his voice trembling with fear. I don't want to stay. I don't want to be part of the story. Carlos's hollow gaze softened for a brief moment, as if understanding the fear in Lucas's eyes, but it was fleeting. The shadow of the hotel's curse pressed against him, its suffocating grip closing around his chest. You don't have a choice, Carlos replied, his voice turning colder, more insistent. Or, none of us do. The air grew heavier. The hotel itself seemed to groan under the pressure, as though it were alive, breathing, feeding off their despair. The whispers grew louder, 100 voices speaking in unison, urging Lucas forward. urging him to finish the story. Finish it. Finish the story. The hotel was closing in on him, its hunger relentless. The walls warped and stretched, the darkness swirling around him like a storm. He could feel his mind slipping, the line between reality and nightmare blurring until he was no longer sure where one ended and the other began. And then, as if pulled by some invisible force, Lucas found himself standing in front of the same desk he had seen in the mirror earlier. It was the same desk, the same journal, the same room that had trapped Carlos. The room he had read about in the journal. The room where the story had been written. His fingers reached for the journal, his hand moving almost of its own accord. The pages fluttered open, and the words were there, waiting for him, as if they had always been written in his mind. "The hotel will not let you leave." The words were his own now, as if he had always known them, as if they had always belonged to him. He felt it then, the pressure in his chest, the crushing weight of inevitability. The story had already been written, and now it was his turn to finish it. Lucas picked up the pen, the same pen that had once belonged to Carlos, and with a trembling hand he began to write. The hotel would never end. The pen trembled in Lucas's hand as it hovered over the journal, its dark ink almost beckoning him forward. His mind was clouded, caught between fear and a strange, overpowering compulsion. Finish the story. The whispers came again, clearer this time, like the urging of 1,000 voices intertwined. The hotel was alive, hungry, and the story was its lifeblood. He had no choice. It was not just a choice of survival, it was a pull deep inside of him, a need that could not be ignored. His fingers moved of their own accord, the pen scratching across the yellowed paper. The words came easily, as if they had been waiting for him all along. The hotel needed him to finish. "I have become part of the hotel. The walls have swallowed me, and the echoes are mine to command. I am the story now." The pen moved across the page, each stroke sealing his fate, each word chaining him to the hotel more tightly. The room around him seemed to grow darker, the air thick with something ancient. Behind him, the figure of Carlos appeared again, his skeletal form standing silently at the door. His hollow eyes locked onto Lucas's, and for a moment there was a flicker of something, regret perhaps, or was it understanding? "We are all part of it now," Carlos's voice whispered, faint, distant. "The story is never truly ours. We are just characters, trapped in the loop, forced to live and die again and again." Lucas couldn't look away from the journal, his hand moving faster now, the words flowing uncontrollably. "I will never leave. I will never be free. I will remain here, trapped between the walls of this hotel. The story will go on forever, with no end, no beginning, just endless echoes of those who have come before me." With each sentence, the pull grew stronger. The hotel was consuming him, folding him into its fabric. He could feel himself becoming one with the story, his body, no longer his own. The reflections in the broken mirror blurred. The room itself began to dissolve, replaced by shifting shadows, fading echoes of the souls that had been here before him. His mind fractured as the weight of the curse settled upon him. He was losing himself to the hotel's will, his identity slipping away as it had for Carlos and for every other soul who had come before. He was no longer Lucas. He was no longer anything. He was part of the story, part of the hotel. The journal's pages began to turn on their own, the ink bleeding into the fibers of the paper, the words becoming one with the walls, one with the darkness. But just as he felt himself slipping entirely into the hotel's grasp, a flash of clarity cut through the fog, a faint fading memory, his life before the hotel, before the pull of the darkness. He remembered the warmth of the sun, the feeling of the outside world, the taste of freedom. It was so distant now, like a dream he could barely recall, But it was enough to give him the strength to pull his hand away from the journal. His breathing was shallow, his chest tight. The room spun, and for a moment he thought he might collapse into the void. But he fought it. He fought against the darkness pulling him in. "I won't become part of it," he whispered, though the words felt foreign, disconnected. "I won't." The hotel shook, as if it was displeased, its shadows writhing and twisting around him. The mirror cracked further, the glass fracturing like a spiderweb, reflecting 1,000 versions of Lucas, each one more twisted than the last. He could feel the pull, could feel it tightening around his soul, trying to crush him, trying to swallow him whole. But he fought, pushing against the tide. He had to finish it, he had to. In one last, desperate act, Lucas grabbed the pen again and wrote a final sentence, his fingers moving almost involuntarily, the words spilling from him as though they were written by someone else. "I am free." The story ends here. The moment the last word left the page, the world around him shattered. The hotel groaned, its walls cracking and collapsing in on themselves, the shadows flickering like dying embers. The mirror, the one that had once trapped him, shattered completely, its shards scattering across the floor like 1,000 broken promises. Lucas felt himself being pulled one last time, but this time it wasn't into the darkness. It was into the light. The hotel's grip loosened, the weight of its curse lifted. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lucas could breathe freely. He was no longer a part of the hotel's story. He was free. The last thing he saw before the world around him completely dissolved was the figure of Carlos, standing in the doorway, watching him with those hollow eyes. But this time, Carlos didn't look hollow. He didn't look lost. He looked at peace. Then everything faded into light.